So today's question is, at what poundage does their expensive X10's become worth it? And I think that's a really good question. I won't lie, I get asked that type of question all the time because there's such a range of equipment available today. When do we go for the gold standard? So today I've got Ash joining me again. So hello, Ash.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, it's good to join you again. I think that is a good question. I think a lot of people, are probably wondering about this.
Yeah, and it's such a hard question to answer because what I have to kick it off with by saying $500 is worth different amounts to different people.
Yeah.
I know athletes who I can almost say from the day they started, or at least from the first month, they shot X10's. Because
from the beginning.
To them it was a reasonable expense for a sport they wanted to get into, and they never thought twice about it. And if that's your financial situation, that's fantastic. It's not gonna hold you back. It's not gonna cause any problems. But also, there's a lot of people out there where $500 is a lot of money. So they do need to put more thought into this. Do you have any rules, Ash, or do you just take it as a feel? Is your shooting progressing as you like, or would you like some expert coaching from a friendly face? If so, the details are in the description. Now back to the video.
I can see what this person's asking with the poundage, but in some ways it's kind of less about poundage and sometimes more about maybe experience or maybe about if you're still growing. So I'd start by saying X10's are definitely not worth it if you have a son or daughter that is still growing, because it's going to becam
unless $500 is just a good night out to you, then it's fine. You have to come back to that. I also want to go in there with people. They're talking about the poundage, but I think he's thinking about the X10 being a heavy shaft. But depends where you are on the spectrum, because one of the lightest arrows Easton make is the Easton 1,000 spine X10.
True, yeah.
And people don't forget that. They think of X10 as only being a heavy arrow. And I had an athlete who was struggling to reach 50, really lightweight compound archer. And I looked on the chart, and the Easton 1,000 spine X10 was the lightest, best arrow for her. And no one had even thought about X10s, because in their mind, that's a heavy performance shaft. But it depends.
Yeah.
Depends where you are on the chart.
And if I was to give a rough poundage kind of guideline, let's say for 70 meters, if we assume someone's shooting 70 meters, a 720 or head-to-heads or whatever.
Or for compounds, we'll be talking about 50 meters, but yes.
Yeah. For recurve, if someone said, okay, gun to the head, poundage number, I would probably say you're going to struggle with X10's at 70 meters if you're shooting less than 37 pounds is going to be really...
I was about to say 38. That was going to be going to be my guess. So I'm glad that we weren't too far apart.
Yeah, you're going to really struggle unless maybe you're like really short and you've got like 24-inch arrows and you can actually get, you're shooting, because obviously with the shorter arrow you're going to get a higher spine, like you were saying, it's going to become lighter. But if you're like average height, if you're a guy that's like 5'10" or whatever, and you're shooting 35 pounds, it's not going to work.
And another thing is, if you have a head shaped like me and you, where it's a little bit squashed, the distance for us between our eye and our chin is much greater than some athletes have had a more rounder face, because you can lose 1.5 centimeters in sight mark just because of the shape of your face. So even though we're both shooting the same poundage, my sight mark can be 15 millimeters higher just because I've got a big old chin. It's these factors all come into it when you're trying to reach the distance.
Exactly. And I would definitely say, if you're new to the sport, say for example, if you've done your beginner's course, you've shot for a year or two, in that period, especially, I think probably different for compound, maybe we can talk about that in a minute. But for recurve, I think it's unlikely that you should get X10's at that point, because you're probably going to change your draw length, you're probably going to change your full draw position, probably going to change your poundage and your limbs, and you're basically just going to end up throwing money away because you haven't solidified down into like, oh, I need this spine, and you're going to have to probably buy another dozen and then maybe another dozen.
I've known some people who are in that sort of changing situation. They've had one particular event in the summer that they want to be their peak performance, whether that's anything from a county championships, national championships, or team selection. So they've had one event that they really care about. So I've known people shoot a selection of cheaper arrows and then 6 weeks, 2 months before the main event, they get themselves a set of X10's to try and optimize that performance for that competition. And then after it, when their spec changes, they might go to a different model until again they get round to a tournament they care about. That seems like a reasonable approach if you don't want to shoot X10's their entire year, but you want to have the best performance possible. That felt like a reasonable strategy. The athlete that was doing that.
And if we're going back to poundage, and if you have to kind of say to an athlete like, okay, you know, maybe they've been shooting a couple of years, 3-4 years or something, and they're kind of increasing poundage. If they're looking quite stable with their full draw position, their draw length, what poundage would you say? Because I've got an idea in my head, but I don't want to say it. Let's see if we're on the same page. What poundage would you say is like really prime, like, oh, you're going to benefit from X10's now?
If you're over 40, if you're getting, I'm mainly thinking of men here, but if you're over 42, coming up to 44, you're going to have nothing but benefit there. I would personally think.
42 was the number I had as well.
Okay.
42 pounds. So yeah, similar. Yeah, we're both on similar pages there because
Good to know. If you'd have come out with 52, I'd be like.
But yeah, this is the thing, because you are really going to get that benefit. And even some of my best scores, some of my best performances were with 41.5 pounds shooting 500 spine X10's, massive wind, and other members on the team were shooting 49 pounds. But I was so stable with that poundage, and I was shooting quickly and gauging the wind well, that I was outscoring them with 7-8 pounds less. So there is a balance to be had. And yeah, I think it's probably less poundage than people think. You know, 41, 42 pounds.
It probably is. And with all of this, as you just demonstrated, of course, the person who shoots best will win the tournament. We're not saying if you buy the best arrows in the world, you're definitely going to come out on top. No, you can finish last because it's going to come down to how you shoot. And all we're trying to do is say, for what level of performance you shoot, we're trying to maximize the score for the performance you're putting into it. But we're never saying that you can buy your way onto the podium. And we all know people who have been on a budget, or maybe they've just not been able to get the arrows they need. If they shoot great, you can perform with a variety of different models of arrow. You know, we're just trying to optimize your performance. We're never saying this is the solution or the reason you're not winning. I'm constantly getting that. So I just want to make that clear. We're just trying to optimize your performance. We're not trying to buy your way onto the podium, just to be clear.
Definitely. And also with the X10's, I think a lot of people think what they're buying with the X10's and the reason that they're better, they think is solely because they're heavier. But actually one of the things you're buying is the tolerance of the dozen that you buy being more closely matched, essentially. That's really the biggest thing, because I think the weight... It does impact it, but I would say the weight is probably like a quarter of the actual benefit, and then the real thing is
it's
that
hard
quality,
to quantify. It is. I just never got an arrow that shot as good. And that's such a unscientific thing. But I do know from a scientific engineering point of view, when we've sent arrows to a German engineering testing house, the best quality and the smallest tolerance was always on the X10 shaft. So there's a little bit of feeling, and there's also a little bit of science as well. But of course, all of these things are very, very susceptible, because nothing's going to compensate more for you shooting well. And if you totally believe in your arrows, there's more chance you're going to shoot well. So it's always that juggling act, as it were.
A little bit.
And
But
Sorry, go on.
That's okay. I was going to say, like, I've seen countless people do bear shaft testing, just simple bear shaft testing, 30 meters, bare shafts, shoot the whole dozen. X10's consistently you can get in the gold. If you shoot, you know, within the gold at 30 meters, you can get those in the gold. If you then get ACEs, it's not the same. You'll get maybe 4 or 5 of them that don't consistently go in the gold, and it's not terrible, but the tolerance just isn't quite as good with them. So this is why, you know, X10's really give you that best kind of grouping. What were you going to mention as well?
I'm going to take that question, and I don't know whether they were talking from a recurve or a compound point of view. I think they were talking from a recurve point of view, but from a compound point of view, your options are much wider because we're only shooting 50 meters. There's a much wider range of poundages who can reach 50 meters. So often you've got to think about that sight mark on the recurve side. On the compound, often that's not a consideration. So then it literally does come down to how much do you value performance. How much is an extra 5 points on the scoreboard worth to you? Or do you want to spend that $500 on buying that entry to the Vegas tournament? Or do you want to spend that money on going to see a coach? So it comes down to more of a budget decision. But if you're someone, as we often see, you're putting in the lion's share of your free time into the sport, you're spending the majority of your free money on competitions and travel, and so then it becomes common sense that, well, if I'm spending all of this money and all of this time, spending $500 on arrows is actually really the least of your financial concerns.
Yeah, and especially, I was just thinking about that, especially indoors, because normally you're shooting on a 3-spot face, separate targets. Normally the targets are foam as well, not everywhere. But if you are shooting indoors foam, separate arrows, then you're not going to damage. You're doing something wrong if you're damaging them.
Yeah.
So that's quite a lot. It gives your X10s a little bit more life. Before, there was one other thing. I think we wanted to talk about the Parallel Pros a little bit. You mentioned earlier.
Yeah, we had
before we
another
jumped on the
question
call as well, didn't we?
Asking us what are our views on the Eastern Parallel Pro.
Yeah.
Because I think that's certainly been an arrow which seems to be popular with some of the athletes I'm working with. I've never shot it because it's come out since I retired, so I haven't actually used it. But looking at all of the spec and all of the feedback, yeah, it looks like a great. Do I want to call it intermediate to competition arrow? It's a competition arrow, but it's not. At no point are they saying this is as good as the X10, but it is also half the price. So that seems like a good option as well. It's a little bit bigger in diameter, but it's definitely not a big carbon. It's still in the small category. It's just not quite as micro as the X10 or the X10 Pro Tour. But it seems like a good choice to me. How about yourself? What's your views?
I'm kind of impressed. Again, I've not shot the Parallel Pros, but I'm kind of impressed with them because it seems like a great option for a lot of people. So archers that I coach often would have this dilemma of maybe they've already got X10s and they've just changed their poundage or draw length and they've got to get another set, or their current set of X10s they've had for a few years and they're worn out. Maybe they're shooting like maybe around 600 on a feet to 70 meter or something. I think for these types of, for that type of archer, that is a great option because if you're shooting around 600, you don't need that much of the, the tight tolerances with the X10. And actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but so the Parallel Pro is essentially like an ACC from previously, but with tighter matching for the dozen.
Yes, so it is the same tolerances as the X10 and the ACE.
So that's what you're getting, yeah.
Yeah, you're getting the quality. You're just getting an arrow that's half a grain per inch. It's literally halfway between an ACE and an X10. It's the physical size of the AC, but the weight is halfway between the ACE and the X10. But the quality is there. It's just an ACE that hasn't been barreled off. So it makes the ends a little bit thicker, so it probably makes the ends a little bit more durable because the ACE, sometimes at the knock end, when you hit a knock, they've always been prone to Robin Hoods, which is nice in one way and not so nice in another. But so no, it's really in the middle, and it's half the price. So if you're on a budget, it seems like a way of, and of course I would think that would be an even better budget option for a compound than would for a recurve, because that half a grain of weight difference for a compound archer, that's not going to be significant at all. So you're trading off a little bit less of wind drift because it's a slightly bigger arrow. It's going to drift slightly more. But again, compounds, we're shooting 50 meters. We've got much faster bows. So it's probably a much more balanced trade-off to make.
Yeah, and you don't need to. The only other benefit of the barreled arrows is that forgiveness on the release, but that doesn't really apply as much to compound anyway because
not at all. But on the recurves, do you want to just touch on that, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand why an ACE or an X10 is barreled different to a Pro Tour.
Yeah, so essentially the back of the arrow is barreled so that it flexes more, so that if you do a dodgy release, then essentially the back of the arrow kind of wobbles more and absorbs some of that bad release. So that's essentially one of the other things you're getting from the X10 compared to like an ACC. You also get that from the ACE, like you mentioned.
Absolutely, because I see a lot of people, because what people soon realised when ACEs and then particularly X10s, because the barreling is even more pronounced, they notice that they stiffen up their arrow a lot more by cutting off the back than the front. But you do pay a forgiveness price. I've known a particular athlete, to get their arrows to match, they chopped like 1.5 inches off the back of the arrow. And sure enough, on the bare shaft tune, it did straighten it up. But I'd always look at their score sheet and think that their bad arrows were worse than they should be. They might shoot 4.10s, but then they followed it with an 8 and a 7. And I always just wondered whether, because that barreling is there to make it forgiving, and that's the last thing as a recurve archer, especially myself with my release. I needed the most forgiving arrow I could possibly get. And yes, your bare shaft might be telling you your bow is, but if you've just chopped off that barreling, you may have cost yourself points in other areas that you don't really notice, because you've done a bad shot, but was it bad for an 8? Was it bad for a 6? It's really hard to gauge that unless you have something to compare it against, because who knows? No one knows how bad that shot was. It's only till you make a change and then you realize, oh, that was a terrible shot, and you look and it's in the 9. It's only then it's easy to look back and realize that your setup was unforgiving. But when you're shooting an unforgiving setup, it's very hard to know, because you've done a bad shot, but you don't really know how much you should have been punished.
And on that point, I've actually previously asked, because there was a couple of people on the British team that cut from the back, and I was always curious about this. I've asked Kim Woo-jin and Kubon Chan specifically to whether to cut from the back of the arrow, and they looked at me like I just shot their closest relative. And then they said never cut from the back of the arrow. So just if anyone's wondering.
And that's also the same reason why I get asked is, my brother's got some Pro Tours, can I use them on my recurve? No. You can, they'll choose fine. But no, your score will suffer. Not on the good shots, on the bad shots.
Just when you don't want the arrow to go further from the middle, that's when it will really go out.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you very much, Ash. I think we covered rather a lot there. And for everyone else, see you again soon. If you stayed till the end because you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. It really helps me.